So if you look at housing, Gautam, are you here? He's not here? Okay, I will take this then. Very quickly, as far as housing is concerned, for those of us who've been mucking around in the space for a long time, there's been this chimera in some senses about India's housing shortage. And in some senses, given that we made this commitment of doing housing for all by 2020, the focus seems to be on building new houses. Fine. Actually, and this is work from the Kundu Committee report, it's been around, again, we've been talking about this, I think, for more than 20 years just now. The issue is not of building new houses, the issue is of inadequate housing. And in actual fact, if you look at the vacancies that are there and the sort of availability of housing stock, at the gross level, there isn't a dramatic challenge as far as we're concerned. The question really is of looking at buildings which are physically inadequate, have impossible densities for people to live in, so poor living conditions, and are in hazardous conditions at one end. And of course, the big elephant in the room is about security of tenure. That's been a long battle since the mid-80s, but that in some senses is the core question that we're looking at. And of course, when we're looking at what is notionally called the LRG, I'm not very happy with that term, the share of housing shortage for people at the lower end of the income or consumption spectrum has actually grown, fine? So there's something that needs to be done at the lower end of the spectrum. The supply-focused processes are inadequate to deal with the challenges of delivery at that end, especially for new houses. Now, the operational challenge that we've had is that according to the norms that we have, most households can afford a house that's 5 times their annual income. That's the sort of accepted norm that comes from the Deepak Parekh committee report. So if you're looking at a 25 square meter area that's there, only 20% of the urban households can afford a house that's costing more than 10 lakhs. And most of our supply, there's a lot of work that many of us have been doing on affordable housing. Most of our supply and even the RBI guidelines are about houses that are more than 10 lakhs. Fine? So 80% of the population is unable to afford that. So building new houses in that space is not going to deal with what you've dealt with. You have to deal with other kinds of things that need to be brought in here. Next slide. The census undercounts slum population, fine? But even then, this gives you a fairly good sense of the fact that inadequate housing and slum-like conditions are endemic across much of the country, and most of our focus historically, of course, has been in the large metropolitan cities, starting with Delhi, Mumbai, and sort of Kolkata, etc., etc. But you can see as you go through the urban fabric, and this is the proportion of slum population, that the numbers are quite large and they're scattered across the country. So when we're talking about a builder-led program that's focused on affordable housing, that's going to go to the top 5, 10, 15, 20 cities, because that's what will make sense for them. The private sector is not stupid. They've got certain incentives and certain things to do. They have to meet the top and bottom line. What happens to the rest of the country? And how does one address, those kind of questions? And of course, the core thing that we know, and Sheila and Spark and a whole range of other colleagues have been doing this for the last 30 years or so, that in situ upgrading is actually the way to go. Again, you have to have a graded process. Some things will be open to market, and that might be 50 lakhs plus. But when we're looking at something that has to be built at under 1 lakh or under 5 lakh, dealing with in situ upgradation is a critical thing. And our frameworks for doing this, and we're working quite closely here with the government of Karnataka on this, are inadequate and they're difficult to deal with. It's not so simple because you have to disaggregate process. The only advantage is that in some states, specifically Karnataka, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, etc., there's a large proportion of our slums that are on public lands. So if you look at the situation now and look a little bit ahead, 5 or 10 years ahead, when you're starting to look at your development planning processes, you can actually address this question. I think the big tragedy was that we lost the opportunity of the milllands in Bombay in the 1990s. That if that was actually affected and not turned into all the weird things that we see in Bombay at the moment, in terms of malls and a whole range of other high-end apartments that is there, that could have actually changed around the imagination of the country of how this would work itself out. Do you want to take over for a second? I have one. I'm going to do some water. Can you get me some water for a second? Yeah, just hop in. Just give me some water, please. Yeah, the slides. Yeah, just pick it up for a second. Just give me some water.
question has always been that if current housing remains on publicly owned land, then a claim can be made by the residents who built those settlements to make cities to be part of the public interest to the use of that land. And this strikes at the heart of one of the questions that we've been thinking about, which is, what are the ways in which we should value public goods and public resources across sectors? In housing, the question we're asking is about the way you value public land. How do we decide how to use public land towards what values of public interest? A basti or a settlement is a claim to the state's entitlement towards legitimate housing. When that basti is built on public land, that is a claim being made by people through the practice of occupation. Arguably, and this is the argument I can make to you, say as a personal argument, when bastis are on public land, regularizing, legalizing, and recognizing the housing they have built should be easier for us. And this is a very pragmatic easier, that state governments, without negotiating occupied private land through private landowners, should be able to act on low-income settlements built on their own land, which they hold, we should remember, in trusteeship in our name, not as individual landowners. The second point, very minorly, I wanted to make on the previous slide, if I could see it, is that not only is much of this land public, but it's actually owned by urban local bodies, which means in a federal system, it is entrusted at the city level or at the state level, not railway land, not central government land, which is much more difficult for states to negotiate, because remember, housing is a state subject. Which means we have an opportunity here to move. While occupied settlements remain on urban local body owned land, we have an opportunity to upgrade, regularize, make legitimate, improve, and secure. As this land gets more and more deregulated, taken out, incentivized for infrastructure, used for other purposes, this proportion of public land in our cities is shrinking. The ability to answer the housing shortage at scale is shrinking. So we have a real window here, much like the demographic dividend window, and that this argument on where do occupied settlements sit and who owns this land is a pivotal point that this empiric brings out.
Yeah, okay. Let's run to the next slide.
And the other question that we wanted to make, very much in looking at forms of identification, was the idea of slum dwellers as a term being residents that are encroachers or occupiers. And I think these words are very important. When judicial cases and government speak of encroachers, instead of either workers or citizens or residents, you are determining actually the way we will judge the worthiness of our fellow citizens and the worthiness of the claims they make, and therefore the proportion of resource they will be able to command. We're all fighting for resources from the state. We're fighting for attention, we're fighting for budgets, we're fighting for headspace, and we're fighting for media inches. And what this graph shows is that residents of what we call slums as illegal occupations are workers with multiple layers to their lives. And a very quick empirical snapshot of that is that we recognize them as people who hold ID cards, passports, worker cards, welfare cards, registration cards, every other emancipation of what makes all of us citizens. You pull out your wallet, you say, this is who I am, here are my 7 cards that give me legitimacy in speaking to the state. That exact performance, though with far less legitimacy, is performed. Right? So when we look at the fact that 70 to 80% of residents in slums exist formally and legally in multiple other parts of their lives, but we speak of them only in the context of the illegality of their homes, but not in the context of the legality of their work, or their tax payments, or their bill payments, or their service access, or their citizenship documents. We are reading one part of their lives, and we are basically reducing people to the illegality of the slum in which they live in. We're reducing people to that built environment. It's a deep reduction that changes the way we discuss housing. Yeah? We're looking very much here. We wanted to show here to make an argument about the history of home ownership policies in India that have really centered on ownership. This is a key discussion point in our sectoral section this afternoon, that we have never taken seriously how to leverage rental housing at all income levels as part of public policy. In fact, we have actually, in many ways, through ill-fitting regulation, outright restrictions, prevented the growth of a private rental market that, nevertheless, all the data is telling us is robust and significant. So yet again, we have a policy situation where rental housing exists despite everything we do to it, as opposed to flourishing because of what we do to encourage and protect it. Now, the question here very much also of, can I see the next slide? And the last part of the story of affordable housing that I wanted to tell is the story of thinking about credit. Now, I'll just say one very quick thing about this. Most housing in India in the low-income affordable housing sector is built in an average of 15 years. The pattern is incremental, it's slow, and it's particular. The way we shift from house to house, we would never move into an incomplete house where the taps didn't flow water and the electricity didn't turn on. That's not the way most urban Indians live. It's one wall at a time, a little bit more money, a next wall becomes pakka, then a setback, you hold on, the concrete bars stick out of the top of your house because you're waiting when you'll build that next half room, you rent it out, you get a little bit more money, you build the next half room, on an average between 15 to 17 years. And on an average, with short-term bursts of credit through formal and informal means to do a little bit more construction. But when you look at our formal affordable housing finance, most of our loans are above 10 lakhs. Most of our affordable housing units in total cost 10 lakhs. Most of our loans are above 7 years term period. Most of them are actually over 15 years term period. So you have a deep disjunct between the housing that people built and its cost, between the type of loans they take in terms of duration and the way they take it. Both the loan ticket size and the loan term size is basically telling us that there is no formal housing finance in the lower end of the housing market, which means you are creating an entirely, and when you look at where people get money for construction, you are looking at friends, you're looking at money lenders, you're looking at own source including labor, and you're looking at an entire, I mean, to me, when we do empirical graphs, the absences are as telling as what we're able to put. Look at the missing. The missing is the largest chunk of small home loans. People are using such intensive strategies to gather money. This is chit funds, committees, lotteries, theft. Like this is what we call jugaad financing. I mean, really at the end of the day, that until the morning of when the loan comes, the resident does not know if the money is going to come and where it's going to come from. And you move. And that's the point that I wanted to make pretty much about affordable housing. The question of variation is one that we show you many maps at various scales, and I can show you the difference in north and south on housing quality. But the point is that when we reach metropolitan levels, the intra-city variations in housing are as important as the state level variations or the national level variations. These two graphs show you two very different cities, Bangalore and Delhi, an index of housing quality, looking at the material of roof, wall, and floor, that shows you that actually in Delhi, there is a deep centralization of good quality housing and a very noted center periphery pattern. In Bangalore, there's a much greater evenness of housing quality across the wards. Now, this is what we're able to do because the ward level housing data is finally coming to us. It's still inadequate. It aggregates in a very poor way. But what this tells you that if you want a strategy for Delhi, you have to spatialize that strategy very differently. Your priorities are different. You enter different regions. If you give equivalent housing resources to each ward in Delhi, you will make inequality worse. If you give equal allocations to each ward in Bangalore, you'll have a much more egalitarian effect. We have to recognize these differences, that this is 10 million and 19 million. These are no longer, the intra-city variations are orders of magnitude that exist on their own. Next slide, please.
Thanks.
And I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Gautam.